Hey, happy Friday. A little messy today, a little comfy today, but we're gonna go with it. It's been a long day. I had a massage tonight, which sounds like really luxurious, but really it's because my entire body is like one tight muscle, so we're working on that. But it also surprisingly felt appropriate for this book for reasons that we will get into in terms of how our characters kind of dealt with things. And additionally, I just this week said I didn't have a recollection of what book made me cry this year. I was like, I know I've cried during a book this year, but I couldn't tell you which one. So the universe was of course like, we're gonna fix that for you, and you were definitely going to cry reading Happy Place by Emily Henry. Now, this is of course an incredibly buzzy book. I am very late to the game by like buzzy book standards here. I don't know if anyone is even still interested in my opinion on this. Probably not, honestly, if my Feature Friday on Book Lovers is any indication, but this is a really interesting book to dig into. Now, my caveat is I have not read People We Meet on Vacation, because while I have tried to stay away from, and I think successfully kind of have, the discourse around this book online, I do know that people kind of bunch People We Meet on Vacation with Happy Place and Book Lovers with Beach Read. And I really enjoy Beach Read and Book Lovers, and not just because Beach Read has a Jonathan Franzen dig. I was actually talking with a coworker about this today because she saw I was reading Happy Place and she was like, hey, I didn't get the Book Lovers hype. And I was like, that's fair. I did enjoy it, but I could see why it would be hard for other readers potentially as well. And so I think this is one of those things. I saw a TikTok from someone, and of course I can't remember who, and I didn't bookmark it, so I apologize, but she was talking about how personal her reaction to Happy Place in particular was, because she was talking about Happy Place, and how it was very visceral and it felt personal to her. So in some ways she had trouble kind of hearing criticism for the book because it felt so personal, which honestly is one of the reasons I am wearing this Taylor Swift Eras t-shirt, because it evoked similar emotions to me while reading as some of these songs. It felt very Taylor Swift coded, as the internet would say. And on the eve of our Speak Now Taylor's version re-release, very end of a decade, start of an age, because we are following our protagonist Harriet, and we are in her point of view. And she is going to a cabin on the East Coast with her friends for a long weekend. And this is a standing getaway, a chance for her to reconnect with her family essentially, because she is so close with this group of people, and she has such a high demand job. She is training to become a surgeon, and she's really in the thick of it. And then she gets to the cabin having been picked up by her friend, and she is shocked to see her ex-boyfriend standing there, who is part of this friend group, but they had kind of agreed to split the friend vacations in the divorce, so to speak. And so Harriet was going to get this vacation. However, their friends kind of surprise them because they know, or their friends think they know, that Harriet and Wynn have been apart. Wynn back home taking care of his sick mom after his dad passed away, and Harriet doing her residency. Granted, I don't know a whole lot about medical school. What I do know a whole lot about is her backstory in Indiana, not necessarily her specific family dynamics. And to be fair, she is from Southern Indiana, which I have said before and will surely say again, Northern and Southern Indiana are very different landscapes. However, it felt very real to me, and there's so much emotion in this that feels very real. And I think that's why it's so personal to people, because I admittedly went in not really sure what to expect. It was one of those things where the hype has become so big, and I've read Emily Henry. I've read her young adult, although only one title of her young adults back when it published. And so I've watched this transition into this breakout adult romance star, although I would argue that this is women's fiction. And I think that the transition into hardcover is another argument for that, even though traditionally very popular romance authors have also been published hardcover first in romance. We've got Nora Roberts, we've got Jane Ann Krentz. It's been a while since we've seen someone really take off and transition into that model, which was a very 2000s-ish model to my recollection and anecdotal evidence, which to be fair, can't be fully trusted. But as I also said with book lovers, the journey is forwarded by Harriet and Harriet's journey and her discovery rather than by the relationship between Harriet and Wynne. It is a central, integral part of the story. It is the impetus of the story, the inciting incident, if you will, which structurally, the structure of this book is kind of interesting, right? Because it's a little bit quieter, it's a lot more internal. And when we kind of think about that classification of women's fiction, which has been historically pretty divisive because we have used it to kind of undermine or belittle works that live in that category in the same way that we often have with romance. I mean, not me personally, but we also recognize the buying power of it. In the 2000s, women's fiction was huge and there was huge commercial success in the sector. And so there's this kind of combination of not looking at women's fiction as real literature, real fiction in whatever way. It's this subcategory because it is being led by women and women's stories, but then also the huge buying power of that. And we are focused on these much more internally driven things, which we get in regular fiction from men's journeys and women's journeys now as well, but we get it in a similar vein in literature. So a lot of the discourse around it, especially from prominent authors, prominent women authors who are being shuffled into this subcategory of women's fiction, is that they are exploring similar feelings, similar stages of life, but this idea that, as it has been kind of explored a lot, women are more willing to read about men than men are to read about women. Granted, that is a gross oversimplified statement. I read a study to back it up at one point, but I can't remember where to cite it. But I wanted to kind of dig into this idea of women's fiction, which I think is becoming a little bit more prevalent again in the discourse, not because I wanted to sit in that discourse, but because I think it's important to look at structurally in terms of how this is a quieter novel. Because I was going in, like I said, with the hype, and I was kind of bracing myself to be disappointed in a way, and I know that sounds bad. I was going in with an open mind, don't get me wrong, but also the hype was so large. The book was sitting in a category that I was told by other readers I wouldn't like as much as this other work I really enjoyed, and I was kind of just gauging it. And at the beginning of the book, or for most of the book, it is a much stiller thing. I found myself like halfway through the book going, what has happened here? Because basically Harriet and Wynne are ambushed on this vacation. It's three couples on this vacation that grew up in college together, except for like one partner that entered later in life but is part of this group, and this is their last summer. This vacation cottage is owned by one of the friends' fathers, and he's going to be selling it. And in addition to that, to kind of celebrate this last summer together, one of these couples has decided they're going to get married. So there's no way out for Wynne and Harriet in this scenario, and they decide they have to pretend they're still together for their friends in order to not ruin this weekend for them. And so there is a reason that they're lying to their friends, essentially. It makes sense. Often the framing of that device feels a little bit more contrived, but here I understood it. And the emotion is what Henry does so well, and it really digs into it to the point where I was about halfway through the book before I was like, what's going on here? It doesn't feel like we're building to anything, but we were. We were building very slow and steady because the narrative was told back and forth in real life versus the happy place, which at first I kind of side-eyed, I'm not gonna lie. It felt a little too forced, but it was this idea that we were contrasting the current moment with Harriet's happy place, which the beginning of the book kind of shows us her like mid-meditation, really trying to get a hold of herself. We get this sense that she's been doing a lot of internal work, but we also get the sense and the knowledge over the course of the book that she's really holding a lot of emotion and feeling inside. She is someone that doesn't want to speak her desires out loud for the fear of being disappointed, and she is someone that avoids conflict at all costs because she doesn't want to lose this group of people that mean so much to her. And all of this further supports this central conceit of the book. So in a way, the relationship, which is usually what I'm the most invested in, I was invested in, especially as it was such an adult look at things. We saw these people that truly cared about each other. We didn't get a sense for a long time what the true breakdown of the relationship was, and we got that kind of gradual build as we got with everything, and we saw a lot of these characters revealing themselves slowly, and the contrast of the happy place and flashbacks helped with this maneuvering. And for the first half or so of the book, where I got to about the halfway point, and I was like, I'm not really getting to know these characters in this happy place. I'm not really getting a feel for them. And at first that frustrated me, but as things started to break down with these characters, with these relationships, I understood that, and it felt incredibly purposeful, because then we were really looking at everything through this veneer of toxic positivity in a way, which I know is like a hot, buzzy topic right now, but it also goes back to these characters and how they're clinging so tightly to this thing that is inevitably going to change, but they're afraid to see change, and this idea of what change looks like. This is a last summer, so we're in this kind of suspension for most of the book, this idea that we are clinging to the past in some way, even as we're looking to this future and we don't know what it's going to hold. And this leads to a lot of conflicts between the couples and the friends that is really restrained at first. It takes a couple of days for those barriers to come down. And we see the tensions building naturally, even as we're so focused in particularly on Harriet and Wren and what's going on there. I was personally incredibly clued into the tension that was building throughout between Cleo and Sabrina, Harriet's other friends. And it shows Harriet really trying to navigate this, seeing the tension herself, and really trying to put a stop to the conflict, because she doesn't really have a sense of being able to fight without something breaking down, which we see reflected in the breakdown of her relationship with Wren, as these things kind of mirror and reflect. And so we really are looking at how to love each other and how we form bonds and how those bonds last, because these are college relationships, and not all college relationships transfer into full adulthood, unfortunately. And it's really looking at this transition into adulthood, what we want out of our lives, what we have historically thought we wanted and why, how we are positioning ourselves against others. One of the common refrains in the book that really hit me hard, because I know I personally struggle with this, is Wren is constantly being self-deprecating throughout the course of the book. And we see Harriet really start to call him on it. And it really made me aware, because I know that that is something I'm personally guilty of. But then also we're looking at the idea of self-deprecating humor. And then another piece of the book that at first I didn't think was really working for me. And to be honest, even toward the end, I still had some gripes with it, but I kind of saw what was going on, is that there was a lot of banter in this book. Now, don't get me wrong, if you've been here for a second, you know I really respond to banter, but I don't like banter where it feels too forced, or it's banter for banter's sake, and it feels like it thinks it's being too clever. And we kind of teetered on that edge for me here, I'm not gonna lie. However, I do think this circles back around to the idea of toxic positivity and the idea that all of these characters are really putting on a front. So they are pretending in some way, they're hiding their true emotional underbelly, even from these people that are incredibly close to them. There's this idea later in the novel too of not wanting to be a burden, but even when these characters get into these fights eventually, they're also able to see each other so clearly. They've known each other for so long, and I think that there's something really beautiful there in watching them fight for these relationships that are important to them. Now, I also don't think it's inherently wrong or bad if relationships just kind of naturally come to an ending point, or if you kind of shift into being something else for a person in different phases of life. And this is really exploring both that idea of community, but also having to be really in tune with yourself and happy with yourself. And there's the refrain of happy for obvious kind of title reasons, but it feels like it really ramps up toward the end, especially when these characters are very much not happy. They are really kind of stuck in their sadness and their grief over whatever, but particularly the loss of this kind of phase of their life. and the idea that whatever's on the horizon is going to be different. And this also forces Harriet and Wren to face their past and what their future is going to look like, and whether it's going to be together and what broke them apart in the first place. And because of this kind of real inability to get to know them, I got to know their love, but their love always felt very rooted in the protection in some ways, the emotional protection the other offered, which is great. It's a solid base in some ways, but there was a need there, a codependence in a way that wasn't sustainable. And so we watched this breakdown organically, and we watched them kind of rediscovering and finding themselves in their relationship in whatever form that was going to take through this new awareness of themselves. And I loved that it was emphasizing that they had to be okay with themselves. They had to make decisions for themselves and not for the other person. It didn't admittedly give a great view for long distance relationships. I've never personally been in a long distance relationship. I imagine they're very difficult, but I do know that there are people that have made it through them. But I do know that you have to be so communicative within that. And both of our characters here in that period of distance were really kind of at their lowest emotional point, whether from grief and or from like the stress of not only a high stress job, but starting to wonder if that's even where you see yourself, if that's really what you want, everything you've ever worked for, or if it's just what others expected of you, and you being Harriet, kind of grew used to giving others what they expected, or craving the pride that came with following that path. And so there is a lot here about communication. There is a lot here about change. There is a lot here about friendship. And honestly, I found the friendship here so much more interesting in some ways than the romance, but also the friendship and the romance were one and the same, because they were part of this friend group as friends before there was a romance. And I honestly kind of wish all of that was built out a little bit more in terms of Harriet and Wren, because I think a lot of their early relationship was really hidden under this filter of that banter, which makes sense in terms of the structure of the thing. And I do still like the banter because it reflects a really solid friend group that has inside jokes that have spanned decades, but also then just the balance between banter and just honesty in whatever way. Not that banter is dishonest, but at the end of the day, all of these characters could use some therapy. Wynn, I think, is getting said therapy, so good for him, but I think all of the characters could use some therapy, which is fair. We all can probably use some therapy. And I think that's part of what makes this so vulnerable, this hit home for some readers, me included. This made me cry. It feels like that montage in many ways, and not just because the book essentially kind of ends with those visuals, but again, it's that suspension. And so we are stuck in this moment at the end of something, staring down the end of something, but we are also cycling through all of the happy memories that led up to that moment and having to decide how to move forward, if we're going to move forward in whatever way. And so there's just something inherently nostalgic and emotional there, and Henry's voice is just incredibly readable. Do I wish that some of this had been built out just a little bit more? Sure. But I think we were aiming for this really steady build of tension until we reached that breaking point, combined with this structure that kind of played with this idea of happy place and kind of hiding the bad over a smile in whatever way, this idea again of toxic positivity. And so I don't know if we ultimately sacrificed some of the narrative to that, but I think it made that emotional breaking when we got there that much more impactful, because we really were at a precipice there. It had built, the tension had built, but there were moments where I was like, what are we even getting to? What are we building to? Even as we could see the little conflicts start to splinter on the sides. So if you've read this, I would love to hear your thoughts. I would love to hear your thoughts on this in relation to Henry's other work, but as usual, thanks for hanging out and listening to mine. Like, comment, subscribe, wherever your heart is leading you in this moment. Read something good, and yeah, bye.